So, good afternoon. Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first debriefing session in 2016. We have several challenges ahead, in particular the net neutrality guidelines and then the upcoming telecoms review. We are ready and willing to continue a close cooperation with the market and all stakeholders involved. So the outline for today is as follows. I will briefly report on the BEREC workshop on net neutrality, which was held on the 24th of February. And then we will present the reports that have been adopted by the plenary. And finally, I will add a few words on next meetings. So allow me some comments regarding the workshop on net neutrality. You all know that BEREC is currently developing guidelines for the implementation of the obligations of the national regulators related to the new net neutrality rules of the telecom single market regulation. As a further step of this work, BEREC held a workshop composed of 2 sessions. In the first session, BEREC members listened very carefully to the view expressed by the following 4 academic, legal, and technical experts. Barbara van Schewick, she is professor of law at the University of Stanford. Then Chris Marston, he is professor of Internet and Media Law from the University of Sussex. Alyssa Cooper, she is from the Internet Engineering Task Force. And then Scott Marcus, he is an independent expert and consultant. The presentation and speeches of the experts heard, as well as the following BEREC internal debate during the session, focused on the following main issues: the extent to which commercial practices such as zero rating can coexist with the new net neutrality rules, the kinds of traffic management practices which will be allowed under the new rules, the role and nature of specialized services and how they relate to the new rules, and last but not least, the parameters of Internet access quality, such as speed, on which ISPs will be required to provide information. I hope you all will understand that it's too early at this stage to present some views on these hot topics, but I can reassure you that with high pressure work we are developing in a pragmatic, substantial way BEREC, that is the German way. In the English version it's BEREC, that BEREC will provide its guidelines that ensures a consistent implementation of the new rules. Further on, BEREC intends to publish the draft guidelines for public consultation following its second plenary meeting on the 2nd and 3rd, after the 2nd and 3rd June of this year. And the usual debriefing session, which is planned for the subsequent week, actually for the 6th of June, will be organized in a slightly different way. That means the so-called BEREC mini board, composed of the BEREC chair and the vice chairs, together with the relevant chairs of the expert working groups, will present the draft guidelines and will be ready and happy to exchange on them during this event. So this will be made in another broader setting to give you the direct impression and to have a direct dialogue with those involved in the process. On the same day, the public consultation will be launched and will last until Monday, the 18th of July, which means we will provide a prolonged consultation phase of 6 weeks. Following the evaluation of the contribution received, the final adoption of the guidelines is planned for the end of August by an extraordinary plenary meeting. So you can imagine that we really are taking care of those sensitive issues. And coming to the second topic, the debriefing on the outcome of the plenary session itself, I would like to hand over to Elisabeth from RTR, from our Austrian colleagues. She's co-chair of the relevant expert working group, and she will briefly present the documents and reports on international roaming. So, Elisabeth, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I will present today the guidelines which were updated with regard to the new TSM regulation, as well later on the wholesale roaming market report. First of all, I start with the guidelines. As you might be aware, on the 13th of April this year, the first steps of the provisions of the TSM regulation on roaming, namely the transitional period, enters into force. At that time, operators need to offer for new and existing customers the so-called Roam Like at Home Plus tariffs. In order to provide operators some guidance for the implementation, BEREC updated the general guidelines taking into account the new provisions. The changes in the guidelines deal especially with the transitional period and with this stage not include the final Roam Like at Home Plus fair use regime. Therefore, another update of the guidelines might be needed once the Commission adopts its implementing act on the fair use and sustainability clause. The parts of the guidelines that refer to provisions of the guidelines of the regulation that did not change in the TSM regulation remained unchanged in the guidelines as well. I would also like to mention that the guidelines are designed to explain the regulation in order to allow a harmonized application throughout Europe and are not presented as an official legal interpretation. So coming to the main changes of the guidelines. First of all, the guidelines include a definition of domestic retail price, which is the basis for retail regulated roaming prices. In the transitional period, operators are allowed to charge, in addition to the domestic price, a surcharge, and this surcharge shall not exceed the regulated wholesale cap set out in the regulation. For incoming calls, the surcharge is defined by the implementing act of the European Commission, which is based on the weighted average MTRs in Europe. The guidelines explain also the details about the surcharges and also refer to the price caps for fixed periodic roaming tariffs or roaming packages, which are under certain rules still be allowed under the new regulation. The guidelines also explain how and to which customers the new regime has to be applied and also how to deal with the alternative tariffs, which can be still offered by operators and deliberately chosen by customers. The guidelines also refer to the fact that under certain circumstances there might be a right to withdraw from domestic contracts depending on the national laws. The TSM regulation also deals with billing or charging intervals. BEREC would interpret the regulation in this regard in a way that these provisions only refer to the surcharge and not to the domestic part of the call. The guidelines also include a section about tariffs that do not include roaming at all. Here we see that the roaming regulation does not oblige operators to offer roaming services for all customers, but if they offer roaming services, they need to comply with the regulation. Furthermore, because of the new provisions and update of the exchange rate was necessary, and also, last but not least, BEREC updated the section dealing with machine-to-machine communication in accordance with the report on enabling the Internet of Things, which was also adopted during this plenary. The second document from the roaming perspective is the Wholesale Roaming Market Report. Here on 26th of November, the European Commission launched a public consultation on the review of the wholesale roaming markets, the fair use policy, and the sustainability mechanism. BEREC's response to the EC's public consultation in respect of its review of the wholesale roaming market is this report. The findings are based on responses we received from operators and NRAs to a questionnaire which we submitted to them in September last year. Coming to the main findings on the wholesale roaming market. BEREC analyzed the domestic, retail and intra-EU roaming market in terms of consumption and prices and found out that the data shows a lack of convergence of consumption and prices. Especially this is the case for data services. BEREC also observes big differences between EU countries in the travel patterns. When having a look at the retail offers currently available in the market, BEREC identified a range of different Roam Like at Home offers or variants of such offers which include special add-ons. The number and range of such offers are diverse in nature with different terms and conditions, including different fair use limits. For example, there are fair use limits in terms of maximum call duration, number of days abroad, or there are limits in terms of geographic scope. The most complete offers or offers that are most similar to the definition of the current regulation tend to be targeted at intensive users. What concerns the wholesale roaming agreement, BEREC concludes in its report that the agreements are in general negotiated annually. This is because of uncertainties in terms of volume forecasts, for example. And they are based on a variety of pricing models. For operators which are part of larger groups, such annual agreements would tend to be negotiated at the group level. The responses to the questionnaire also show that light and full MVNOs see their position weak compared to MNOs due to their lack of volumes and also due to less negotiating power. MVNOs, therefore, in many cases cannot benefit from lower actual observed wholesale rates, and this is also especially the case for data. So BEREC concludes in its report that, therefore, in view of the abolition of retail roaming surcharges, it is needed to adapt the condition in the retail and wholesale roaming market to achieve a balanced outcome for home and visited networks. The last section of the report provides different regulatory scenarios how the wholesale roaming pricing policies could be modified so that operators can provide retail roaming services at the domestic price level. The first option is a continuation of the cap regulation. This would mean that the final level of the cap can be based as now on European level, or it could be based on a per country level. The cap could be set on the minimum cost of an operator in Europe or on the maximum cost of an operator in Europe. BEREC provides for all of these options in its report the pros and cons. A large majority of operators sees a need for a consistent regulation of MTR throughout Europe. BEREC therefore provides some scenarios for addressing this issue. One of these could be, for example, a further harmonization. It could be to exclude the MTR part from the caps, which currently consists of origination, transit, and termination. Another option would be to introduce, in addition to the per unit caps that we currently have, a capacity-based charging model. Last but not least, the report provides some solutions that directly address the concerns of MVNOs. One of these solutions is to oblige the host MNOs to pass on the discounts they receive to their MVNOs. Another option would be to include Roam Like at Home also in the wholesale agreements. So this was the main findings of the wholesale reports, and I pass on to Wilhelm again. Thanks.
Thank you, Elisabeth, for giving us such overview. Another prominent part of our plenary was dedicated to the OTTs. And BEREC has adopted its first OTT report, besides a consultation report has been adopted and published, which summarizes the relevant contributions from stakeholders. The public consultation on the draft document was running from the 5th of October until the 2nd of November last year. In the 19 contributions we received, stakeholders commented on the main issues of the report. That means they distinguished between so-called OTT 0, OTT 1, and OTT 2 services, the scope and definition of OTT services, current trends and developments, regulatory challenges, and the level playing field. The report did not need major changes after the consultation, but only some clarifications. I will briefly summarize the main issues of the report and give an outlook on BEREC's follow-up initiatives in this area. In line with the Commission's approach, BEREC focuses with regard to the telecommunications framework review on the OTT1 services. OTT1 services can be competing services and substitutes to the traditional electronic communications services. The OTT report illustrates some lack of clarity with regard to the current electronic communication services definition, as the interpretation of this definition varies in some member states. The OTT report states the need to provide clarity with regard to the future scope and definition of electronic communication services versus OTT services. The need for a legal basis for NRAs to gather information on OTT providers. We think that in future it will be relevant to monitor electronic communication markets beyond the scope of the classical electronic communication services framework. Furthermore, under the heading Level Playing Field, we have identified the need to carefully assess potential regulatory obligations for ECS as well as OTT services. Should the scope of regulation be increased for OTT providers? That is one question. Another one is, should it be reduced for telco operators? Finding the right balance for the future scope of the framework will be one of the main challenges. As a follow-up, BEREC will provide an assessment of the applicable regulatory regime for electronic communication services, or in brief ECS, and OTT services, rule by rule. Each obligation should be assessed in the light of policy objectives and its proportionality, no matter if the service in question is offered by classical telcos or by OTTs. Consumer needs, functioning competition, and a healthy environment for innovation should serve as yardstick for the assessment in how far it is proportionate to impose the obligation on a specific service. We are aware that the Commission is busy with a similar exercise, and we are looking forward to a close cooperation. The plenary in Rotterdam adopted furthermore the BEREC Report on enabling the Internet of Things. It gives BEREC's survey an assessment of the state of play on machine-to-machine services with the perspective of fostering an environment that will result in sustainable competition, interoperability of electronic communication services, and consumer benefits. The report is aimed at presenting the most common machine-to-machine characteristics and assessing whether machine-to-machine services might require special treatment with regard to current and potential future regulatory issues. The document looks at preconditions for machine-to-machine services to drive innovation. As set out in the report, the preconditions include assuring adequate resources for machine-to-machine services, such as spectrum, numbers, and IP addresses, an EU framework fit for machine-to-machine services, and consumer acceptance for those services depending on transparency, privacy, data security, interoperability of services, devices, and platforms. Following the evaluation of the public consultation, BEREC comes to the conclusion that whereas there appears to be no need for special treatment of machine-to-machine in certain areas of the EU telecoms regulatory frameworks, there are other areas where adaptations might be required in order to address machine-to-machine specific needs and to make the regulatory framework fit for purpose. For instance, roaming, provisions regarding switching the service providers, including number portability. With regard to privacy, BEREC believes that the protection of end users' privacy is a critical success factor for the realization of Internet of Things services. Thus, BEREC recommends a careful evolution process to adapt privacy rules to the Internet of Things environment, especially to make rules on information and consent as user-friendly as possible. This could be considered in the upcoming review of the EU data protection rules. Furthermore, BEREC considers that the use of existing numbering resources, the exterritorial use of numbers, and the use of ITU numbers seems to be a reasonable approach, while the introduction of a European numbering scheme does not seem to carry significant benefits which would justify the deployment costs of setting up such a solution. Finally, I want to present some documents we have published. Please have a look on the BEREC web page. And last but not least, there are several documents we have published. I want to turn your attention to the next BEREC meeting and events. There will be the BEREC Content Network that will take place the 12th until the 13th of May, and it's located in Budapest. And then we will have the second plenary from the 2nd up to the 3rd of June, and it will be located in the beautiful city of Vienna. May I now hand over to Laszlo to inform you in brief about the management committee. Please, Laszlo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Wilhelm. Good afternoon, everybody. Indeed, the plenary meeting also covers... Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Indeed, the plenary meeting also covered the meeting of the management committee of the BEREC office at the same place, at the same time as the Board of Regulators met last week. The management committee has reviewed the standard usual reports on the functioning and operation of the BEREC office. I was happy to report to the management committee that in 2015, both of the two key indicators as the budgetary management of the agency regards met the target that is applicable to all EU institutions, bodies and agencies. These two main indicators are, on one side, the overall execution of the budget, and on the other indicator is the ratio of the cancelled commitments that were carried forward from the previous year. So in both in these key indicators, the BEREC office managed to be within the range expected from all EU institutions. That's the good news. The management committee also adopted two decisions. One was about the working language of the BEREC office. That was a technical decision. And the other decision was the appointment of an accounting officer. That is, this decision is closing our interim period, having a permanent accounting officer appointed now, and at the same time, this function is also externalized from the BEREC office. This decision for the BEREC office, being the smallest agency in the EU, will make it possible to better allocate the limited human resources and to further optimize the operations. So we are very happy of this decision of the management committee. So these were the main points at the meeting, and the second meeting in the year of the management committee will be again back to the Board of the Regulators meeting in Vienna at the second plenary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laszlo. And now it's upon you. Do we have any questions?
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Frederik de Bakker from Telefonica. I have a question on the follow-up you mentioned about the report on OTTs. You said you want to do kind of rule-by-rule review, so to say, of what makes sense and what not. But, and as you also mentioned, now the Commission, in view of the review of the telecom framework, is of course also doing kind of review of some obligations that are in the Universal Service Directive. And I don't know if you foresee any kind of formal input or a report in concrete on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, you know, there is a close cooperation and there are discussions, and you know, BEREC has supported comments on that issue, and we will discuss that further on in the process with the Commission. Please.
Hi, I'm Manuel Braga from Deutsche Telekom. You have been in contact for the NN guidelines with the Commission. You had academics in your last plenary. Do you plan any interaction with the industry up to June?
That is during the consultation process. There is the possibility for stakeholders and the industry to step in the process. Please.
Yes, Friedrich de Bakker. On the roaming report, to be honest, I do not really understood very well the conclusion that was on the slide. I understand all the words and the sentence, but when it says need to adapt the conditions at retail and wholesale level, I really do not understand what kind of conditions you refer to here. Can you give some more detail, because I do not understand the
We see a need to adapt the current wholesale regulation in order to allow operators to provide Roam Like at Home services, but this is not the only way how to achieve the goal of Roam Like at Home, but also the fair use policy and the sustainability clause. The Commission should make use of them as well in order to allow operators to provide Roam Like at Home services. So it must be both retail and wholesale regulation need to be adapted.
Okay. But just to clarify, so with conditions, the word conditions, you refer to wholesale regulation, fair use policy, and sustainability. Okay, thank you. And then, so I understand there will be additional guidelines coming specifically on fair use policy and sustainability after the work of the Commission, right?
This is not included so
Yeah. I understand.
Please go ahead.
You say in your report on the OTT services findings that you think that NRAs need more competence to request information from OTT providers. Do you see that competence also extending out to OTT providers that aren't based in the EU? Or has that not been discussed yet? Because obviously that's quite an important factor in a number of the OTT providers in the market today and tomorrow.
That includes all OTT which offer services. I think that is very simple. In Europe. Please.
Vasila Kledicheva from MLEX. I just wondered if there was a discussion at all at the plenary in Rotterdam about the potential UK exit from the EU, or is that going to be discussed at the next plenary in June? Thank you.
No, we are not a political, we are not a political forum. We are just a technical forum ready to advertise the Commission, and that is a political issue, and that wasn't raised up in Rotterdam. I would went over, if you allow, to Annegret. She will read out some questions we got from Twitter. So we are doing now a modern exercise, and she will answer it directly.
Okay.
Is that okay? Would you accept that? Okay.
So Okay, so we also received some questions on OTT services. The first one relates to OTT services and cybersecurity. There's one question relating, yes, cybersecurity indeed is the task of another or of an agency called ENISA. And as we said already in the report, the future work and as outlined in the presentation, the future work on OTT services will look at predominantly OTT1 services and check on all the obligations for the services in a rule-by-rule assessment. So that's why we have not finalized the work yet. And of course, this also includes various aspects of this work, I would say. Yes. The other questions, I think, are more related or are more addressed to the Commission. So the question is whether BEREC has any idea about possible initiatives of the Commission. Okay, we cannot answer this. This is, should be addressed to the Commission. But we would expect, and that was mentioned, that the Commission will pick this item of OTT services up in the framework review, and I think they have announced this. As said, we are not aware of other initiatives. Maybe the question should be addressed directly to the Commission. And the next one is about details of the Commission's cost models and the plans, where we also do not have more information, and maybe this should be addressed to the Commission as well.
Okay, thank you for that, Annemarie. Please go ahead, you have the floor.
Yes, sorry. Sophie Petitjean, I'm a freelancer. In the OTT report, you said that the assessment of the proportionality would not only mean more rules, but maybe also a continuation of maybe a reduction of the current scope. Does it mean that you support such a reduction, or it's not correct to read behind the lines?
I think we have to wait what is the outcome of the assessment. But to be clear on that, I just want to mention that we try a differentiation between OTT 0, OTT 1, OTT 2 services. And the substitutes are the OTT 1 services. They are similar to telecommunication services. And that is, I think, that the whole discussion will concentrate on this OTT 1 and OTT 0 issue, because that deals with the definition in the framework. So the whole structure has to do with the definition in the framework. And I think that the Commission, as far as we have heard, the Commission is now strongly rethinking the definition they have laid out in the framework. It depends on, we are not the legislator, you know. We will now analyze in our report what will be the outcome, and then that will step in the process to develop the framework. But it's the Commission that should step in the process with concrete proposals. You look a little bit puzzled. I hope I didn't puzzle you. It's okay? Annegret told me there are some more questions from Twitter. Annegret,
Okay.
it's yours.
Okay, there's at least one more about the review of the termination rates regulation. I guess it's meant the termination rates recommendation. And we have not yet received a request from the Commission, and I think first we will concentrate on the framework review.
So if there are no more questions, I want to thank you all attending this session. I think we will see each other then in June. And so far, thank you very much.